Y'all have graphing in math class? Some. So for the sciences, why would we need to graph? Why would we need to, what are we going to put in the graph? What is a graph? I'm sorry? You want to present your data, right? Humans are visual creatures. It's hard to understand lists of numbers. Now, sometimes it can be done. You can see trends in numbers sometimes. But think of it this way. If you're a researcher and you're collecting lots of data, lots of numbers, you want to make sense of them for yourself. Right? So basically two ways you do that. One is statistics to back up your conclusions. And the other is presenting a visual representation of your data. That's what we do with graphs. Now, graphs come in all different kinds. We're going to keep it really simple. We're going to use the Cartesian system. Remember the Cartesian system? It's just two dimensions. I need that part. That one's giving out on me. So which one's the abscissa and which one's the ordinate? That always confused me because it didn't make any sense. Where do they get those names? I think that's how you spell it. Right? Normally what we say here is X axis. It's the Y axis. Now, why are we going to be using a Cartesian system rather than some other, right? You could graph things on a linear scale, right? If your data is only one dimensional. But if your data is two dimensional, which most of the time it is, at least two dimensional, in other words, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, you do something that's quantifiable, right? Say you increase the pressure in a vessel to 10 atmospheres. What's its response? You may be measuring temperature, you may be measuring volume, you may be measuring some other chemical factor, but it's the response. So you have what you do to it and the response. So those two are paired together. Every time you change this one changes. So that's why we have two coordinates. And then if we graph those numbers here, say we have a value here of some x1 and then y1 that go together, right? For this point, that defines that point in this space. Okay. Data is plural. Datum is singular. We never use it because you've always got more than one measurement to make. So data is usually tells you measurement. That's a measurement that's made. And a graph is representation of that data, just as I was told. Now, in the sciences, we, by convention, say that the x-axis or the abscissa measures what I did to the experiment. That's the independent variable. This is the independent variable. And the response is the dependent variable. Okay, that's the y. X is independent, y is dependent. And if you have a value for this one, say I did this to it, and it responded by this, that's where that comes in. That point identifies both the independent variable and the dependent variable that gives me that 1 point on my graph. So if I change it, I'm going to get a different response. Maybe I go out here, do that to it, then it's going to give me a response maybe like this. Okay, I get another one. X2, Y2. And that point, whatever that point is, that represents a measurement, an experimental measurement. As I'm talking, I'm giving you answers to questions. Okay. This Cartesian system is divided into 4 quadrants. Quad comes from the Latin, maybe Greek, or 4. Right? 4 sections. Every value in this section is positive. Okay? Because this is positive direction, this is positive direction. This would be a negative direction, and this would be a negative direction. So if we happen to do something, say we're measuring temperature, or I change the temperature, and the temperature, instead of being right here at the origin at 0 degrees Celsius, maybe I'm going down to minus 20 degrees Celsius, right? So then that gives me a different response. Say it gives me a response, say right about, let's see, here, right? Then you would have a value here of a negative and a negative. Or if it happened to go over to here, say I took that temperature, and then it gives me a value here, this would be a negative and a positive. Okay, so that's the nature of the quadrant system. Plus, plus, minus, plus, minus, minus, and plus, minus. Most of the time, at least in chemistry and physics, we spend our time in this region. Sometimes we drift into this region. And occasionally down here. We rarely ever get down here. Okay. Let's see. We already talked about that. Now, here's an example of temperature on the experimenter is changing the temperature, measuring the volume of a confined gas. Okay. So we find out when we get to the chapter on gases, this will make more sense. But as the temperature increases, volume increases. Right? We increase the temperature, volume increases. That gives you, if you connect the dots, that gives you a line with a positive slope. Slope on this line, you might remember how to calculate the slope. It's the change in y for each change in x. So the independent variable goes in the denominator, dependent goes in the numerator, and it's a change. So if we want to know the slope of that line, we take this one. Sometimes we say rise over run. So the rise is going to be from here to here. Right there. Rise is there to there. And run is from here to here. Or from here to here. Same thing, right? It's a rectangle. So the change in y is the final minus the initial, or it would be y2 minus y1, right? Be the final minus the initial, y2 minus y1. And the change in x would be x2 minus x1. Like that. Okay. Sometimes students have connection problems and you hear them ding back in after something went goofy with their internet connection. Okay. Now, that's easy to calculate for a straight line, right? That's why scientists like straight lines, because they're so well behaved. We only use curves when we absolutely have to. And sometimes we do. And we have examples in this method. Okay, so if we have points that are between here and here, right? Have one there, one there, one there, one there, something like that. Then we draw a line that's best fit among those points. And what we try to do is minimize deviations. In other words, when we draw the line, we want to minimize the distance between the line and the point. Right? Usually in experiments, the points are not going to lie perfectly on a straight line because of experimental error. Error is ubiquitous. We always have error. I think we covered that already. But inside here, we've got a best fit curve or best fit line. Then we can determine the slope. And remember the formula for a line? Everybody knows this one. All right, there's your slope, the M, and there's your y-intercept. So if we complete this line out here like that, there's my B value, y-intercept. That defines a straight line. If you have that straight line defined for these sets of points, then you can say, what if? What if I had actually used a temperature that's not in that group? Say a temperature that puts me right here, right? What then would have been the volume? That's where this formula comes in. Because once you know that value and that value, if we then change to this value, then we can calculate what could have been. Right? That's called interpolation. We're inside the known values of this line. So we interpolate. That's usually fairly safe. If we extend the line out here like that, down here like this, and we say, all right, what if I say X then is down here outside those numbers? And I say, what would the Y be? That's called extrapolation. And that's where it gets more dangerous because you've got no evidence from your experiment what's happening beyond that point. Right? Usually it's going to be behaved, but statistically speaking, it could be right? Farther you get away from your numbers, the broader deviation. So it could be anywhere out here. So that's why we have to be careful with extrapolations because we don't have any physical support from our experiment for them. So notice something else about this graph. Getting kind of busy in here. Let me remove some of the junk. Okay. Whenever you build a graph, the graph must stand on its own two legs. In other words, you pull the graph out of the paper, the research paper, and the graph should tell you everything you need to know to interpret the values that are given in that graph. So the graph needs a title. And say, this is what the graph is trying to show. Say the change in volume with respect to the change in temperature for a gas or a particular gas, whatever the case may be. In this case, we're saying the pressure has to be maintained at 1 atmosphere. Okay. All right. Then you have to label your axes. This x-axis is temperature, right? And what are its units of measure? Well, in this case, they're Kelvin degrees. Right? And this axis is volume. So this is volume. And what's the units of measure? In this case, it's liters. Okay. We're getting there. We're almost complete. Then you have to subdivide, and this is before you can put your data in. Subdivide your axis into uniform, and we're not going to use any logarithmic scales. These are all arithmetic scales, uniform lengths. Right? So in this case, it goes from 50 to 100 to 150 and so forth. And this actually would be 0. In that case, we still might have this one, but we wouldn't have this one because there's nothing below 0 in Kelvin. Right? It's absolute. Okay. So we've subdivided the axis into uniform lengths. We've assigned values to them. And then we do the same thing for the y-axis. So many liters. And we assign values there. It looks like 20, 0.2, 0.4, 0.2, 0.4. And whoever drew this graph made a big boo-boo. Right? They left out the bracketing zeros before the decimals. So I don't even know if the authors are still alive, so I won't complain too bad. Now, anything extra you put in there is fine, descriptive. In this case, we've got the data set that produced the graph. Right? It doesn't have to be there, but you could put that in there. Or you could have a caption down here, right? That gives you some more information. But this is the bare minimum. The title, the label and units, and the tick marks with values for each tick mark. That's so you've got this straight line. And if you say, all right, what if I do instead of say 175, what's it going to be? So you can read the graph. Right. We'll talk about that in just a second, a little more detail. So when I see you, when you make a graph and I see the graph, I want bare minimum that information before you even put points on it. Once you put the points in and then draw your best fit curve, you know, that will be a complete graph. Okay. So the lines that are printed on the page are called the grid. And the numbers that are assigned to the lines intersecting the axis on the grid are the scale units. And then when you have an X and a Y value and you're plotting it on your graph, that's a data point. It represents a measurement. Then you can draw a straight line or a smooth curve depending on what you've got. Say if we did volume, say we just took this one and we say we change the pressure and we get a response in volume, say it's liters, and pressure is in atmospheres. And we measure this, and this title is the variability of volume with changing pressure. Right? Or a gas. And then we can pick a temperature, say at 20 degrees Celsius. And then we put the points in here. We draw a best fit curve. It happens to be a hyperbola. Right? Remember what a hyperbola is? There's a mathematical definition, but for our purposes, a hyperbola is simply a curve that never touches the axis. Right? This go infinitely that direction and never touch that axis. Same that direction. Right? Hyperbola in math terms, hyperbola will usually have a mirror image there, if you recall. And it has a formula. And I forget what the formula is. something squared over x and plus something squared over y equals 1, something like that. But in this case, we get that curve, right? And that our best fit curve minimizes the variation, the deviations of that line from the actual data points. Okay. Now, how do you draw a curve like that? Right, if you're going to do it by hand, you ever heard of the French curve? Yeah, it's a device, like usually a piece of plastic, that has a variable radius curve. So like this. Yeah. So this varying radius of the curve, like bigger radius out here, smaller radius in here, and you can adjust it like that to draw parts of the curve. That's what you would do by hand. And that will give you a best fit. Straight lines are much easier to deal with. Now, whether or not it's a direct relationship or an inverse relationship depends on the slope at any one point on the curve. So this one has a positive slope. That's a direct relationship. In other words, as x increases, y increases. That's a direct relationship. Here we've got, as pressure increases, volume decreases. Now, it's not the same slope everywhere, right? It's a different slope here than it is here, and different slope there. But all the slopes are negative, right? Because what's the initial volume is here, final volume is here. Initial pressure is here, final pressure is here. So the larger minus the smaller is a positive value, and the smaller minus the larger is a negative value. So when you put a negative over a positive, you get a negative slope. But the slope changes. Right? And anybody had calculus? No? Pre-calculus? No? Okay. Something called instantaneous slope. And all we mean is in a curve that changes its slope over the span of the curve, we're talking about the slope at any one point on the curve. And that's the slope of the straight line tangent to that curve. So this tangent has a slope, this tangent has a slope, and they're all different. But they're all negative. So this would be a direct relationship. This would be an inverse relationship. So as pressure increases, volume decreases. That's all we're saying. Now, as a practical matter, if we simplify it to its very, very simplest form, then if we have one variable times a constant of some kind, k, x, then as x increases, y increases. Or if we say solve for the constant, then we have y over x. Right? So if you have a quotient equal to a constant value, as x goes up, y has to go up because that's constant. If y doesn't go up as x goes up, then that's not constant anymore. Okay. So if a quotient is equal to a constant value, that's a direct relationship. Over here, if the product of the variables is equal to a constant, that's an inverse relationship. Because as x goes up, y has to go down in order to keep k constant. Okay? Right. Let's see. We're drawing the axes, assigning variables, selecting the scale units. Okay. Now, I'm sure it's good enough if I say you have to do this exercise because it makes me feel good. But You're actually doing this exercise because it gives you a skill set for presenting your data later. If you learn how to draw graphs, then you can present your data in a recognizable form, something that can help you with your argument. If you're a researcher, your lifeblood, the thing that keeps you employed, is publications. And publications that other people are referencing. That's even more important. Not just the number of publications you make, but who's looking at them and who's using them to further their research. So what you want to do is present your data, present your argument, and back it up with data. And graphing your data is one way to validate your argument for reviewers. Okay. So preparing a graph is essential for arguing your case with your peers. Now, if you're not going to go into research, why else would you need graphs or even be able to interpret graphs? If you're going into, say, medical lab tech, those instruments that you're using, right, they may be highly automated, but internally what they're doing is they're taking calibration samples that you give them and producing a curve that's then used to do what ifs. Right? If you give your instrument a calibration sample here and a calibration sample here, then it electronically draws that straight line, and then whatever reading it gets, it says, okay, I get a reading here. That means it's a concentration there. I'll spit that out. Right? This patient has such and such a concentration of iron based upon that calibration curve. So that's what it's doing inside electronically. And before you can run, you have to walk. Right? This is walking. All right. So if we're going to draw, we're going to put our data on a sheet of paper. And that paper is usually, not always, but usually 8.5 by 11 graph paper. So depending on which way you hold that paper, in portrait, the x-axis would be the shorter one. In landscape, the x-axis would be the longer one. It just depends on how much information you need to include on the x-axis or the y-axis as to which one is portrait orientation or landscape. Okay, that's your first decision. How do you draw the axes on that sheet of paper? What's your orientation? Then you look at the range of your value. You're going to have X values and Y values here, right? And you look at the range of each one. Well, you actually do that before you decide portrait or landscape. And then you look at the range and say, all right, how can I draw my graph? Let's say we decided it's a portrait. And you've got, just imagine the grids in there for me. Then you have your axis here, and you want to use as much of that space as possible for your data. Right? Spread it out as much as possible. Why? Because if you go back to read it, and it's a little line down there, it's not very useful. You can't say what ifs with a little line like that. You need a line that's like that. And then you can say, all right, what if it's this value? Then I get that value. Okay, so we want to spread it out as far as possible. So that's what you do for the X and Y axis, deciding whether it's portrait or landscape. And then you say, how much of this axis do I need to fill that data in there? Right? Say I have up to 100 units in the X-axis, measurements of some kind. Right? And each one of these grids is 5 divisions. If you look at one of those pieces of graph paper, yeah, it's got major grid lines and minor grid lines. Well, if you only go from 1 to the next, say 1 to 10, then each one of those grid lines is 2/10, is 2. Right? That's a little difficult to deal with because 1 is in between each line. So let's say we go 2 of them. So 1 to 10 or 0 to 10 is 2 of these 5s. That makes 10 divisions. We're thinking in decimal terms because it's much easier to deal with decimals than it is with fractions. So let's say we have these 2, and we're going to say this one's 0, and this one's 10, and this one's 20, and this one's 30, so forth. So you can see I'm not going to have enough room to do 100. So what do? Well, you have to shrink it. Right? If you're going to get 100 on that one, you got to shrink it to where you can get 100 out here. And then you look at the divisions that will give you equal amounts up to that 100. Right? We may have to use only 5 each. Do 10 there, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. Right? You may be forced to do that. And then you do the same thing for the y-axis, right? Spreading it out as far as possible. So depending on how you adjust your scales, well, one student could set theirs up to where the slope, it would look like that, and another one, the slope would look like that. But that's just a visual representation. The actual numbers are the same. Okay? And that's a trick that the media uses sometimes to emphasize their points. They'll take and they'll spread the graph out and say, look at that. When if you take a normal vision of it, say there's nothing there. Or if you're dishonest, you'd say, all right, what's the time scale here in thousands of years? I didn't write that in. And then the change in temperature over time. So there's your 0 line. And we're saying we get these points like this, like this, like this, like this, like that. I'm trying to remember the guy's name. It's a climatologist from, he was at Penn State at the time. The hockey stick, the hockey stick. So this is the way it was for thousands of years. And once man got involved and start pumping out CO2, look at it. He conveniently left out the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age. Right? He just threw those out, right? So I haven't heard from him much lately. I think his career kind of went down the tubes. And as it should. That dishonest, you shouldn't have a career in the science. Anyway, so we've decided on the scale, the units first, the divisions of the scale. And we want to say, all right, what are the units? What is this scale going to represent? Is this like temperature? And those units are in degrees C. Well, what's this one? Well, this one would be volume, maybe, and in liters or milliliters, whatever the case may be. Okay. Scale units. And then you draw your best fit curve. And you want to make it as readable as possible. So within the constraints of your environment, make these units as easily readable as possible. And you can't start off here with 10 like this and then end up with 100 there. Right now you're talking logarithmic scale. We're arithmetic. That is, they have to be evenly spaced. Okay. Let's see. Drawing a best fit curve. I mentioned French curve already. Plot your data points. Tilting the graph. Okay, we covered that already. That's portrait or landscape orientation. We mentioned interpolation, extrapolation already. Calculating the slope, right? Calculate the slope of your line. If it's positive, that's direct proportion. If it's negative, or if it's a curve, but every tangent is negative, then it's a inverse proportion. There's your slope. Now, if you find the slope of a line, how do you find the y-intercept? Say you have this equals some value here. We know that value. And we want to find out this one. You just take a point on your curve, plug in that value, plug in that value, plug in that value. Now you've got an equation in one unknown. Solve for it. And that'll give you your y-intercept. Okay? I think you have one problem in there that uses that. That's requirement. Okay. That graph I showed you earlier with volume and pressure, volume on the y-axis, pressure on the x-axis, is a nonlinear curve. And we get those a lot in chemistry, but in this case, here we have an example of volume and pressure, and you see that curve is a hyperbola. Okay. Suppose we want to convert it into a straight line. Right? You can modify your data to give you a straight line. Look at it this way. The expression of that line is actually pressure times volume equals some constant value. That's what gave us the hyperbola, right? Inversely proportional because it's a product equal to a constant. So how do we turn that into a straight line? Suppose this is legal. Right? Divide both sides by the same value, right? Just divide this one by B and divide this one by B. Okay, so that B cancels, leaves us with P equals K over V. That's the same expression. It's just presented differently. Well, I want to separate that. It looks better to me if I say this times 1 over V. What does that look like? Y equals mx. And B is equal to 0. Okay, so now I got a straight line. But what do I have to do to get it? I've got to take the volume and take the inverse of every volume value. If my original data was this, now I need this. So I take the inverse of that value. And now I've got these values. And I plot that one with that one. That gives me a straight line. And there it is. Okay. Now, how do you plot that? Well, are the units going to be the same? No. So everything you do to a variable, you have to do to the units. So if this is in liters, this is going to be what? Liters to the -1. The inverse of liters. Okay. So that will be your units of measure on the y-axis. 1 over V, liters to the -1. Pressure didn't change. Pressure's the same. And it's also got the same mistake. Right? They left out the leading zero. But we find out that when we graph that set of data this way, we get a straight line with the y-intercept through the origin. Okay, you're going to see this again in chapter 5 when we talk about gases. But for now, just learn that technique. Here's some others, right? Nonlinear curves. This one has a negative slope. This one has a positive slope. That one has a negative slope. And these are various transformations. Right? We took, in fact, this one on the lower right, we took the logarithm of a value, the y value, to get that one. There are various ways to make straight lines out of curves. I just showed you one of them. That's the very simplest one. Okay. Okay, up to this point, we've covered things that are there are two sections in this document, if you haven't noticed already. One's a required section and one is bonus section. We've covered everything that's in the required section at this point. The bonus section depends on whether you want to rack up some more points. So this particular section is talking about a titration curve. Everybody heard the term titrate before? It's a technique in chemistry where you determine the value of some chemical, whether it's concentration, usually it's concentration, by adding it to something of known value or known concentration. And there's an equivalence in there somewhere. Right? At some point, you find that your unknown has equated itself with the known. And that way, you can use various calculations to determine that characteristic, the concentration of the unknown. Another way that you can use it is, say, I'm going to be using terms that we haven't got to yet. Everybody familiar with pH? pH is a measurement of acidity. Okay. The lower the pH, the more acidic. The higher the pH, the more basic. Okay. And we can measure that with a device called a pH meter. So if we do that, and we have an acid, a certain amount of acid, and we add base to it, that's what the researcher is doing, adding base to the acid. And we measure pH. Right? We measure, if it starts off with an acid, then you got 1, 2, 3. Now let's see, that's not fast enough. Let's say we had, say 5 here, and 10 here, 15 there. Then you start off acidic, but as you add the base, it becomes, the pH rises. Okay. So you got these points and they go like that. And at some point it flattens out. That's known as the buffer range. And then once you've used up all the acid, then you start adding base and it goes high pH really quick. Like that. And then flattens out again at the top. This is a titration curve for a base added to an acid. So see, it's got multiple curves. It has some straight section in here, and it's got a curve there, and a straight section there, and a straight section there. So it's a very complex curve. This is called a sigmoid because it looks like an S. Okay. You see that in this titration. You also see it in growth curves. Anybody in biology? Okay. You see it in growth curves for, I don't know, bacterial colonies, right? They'll start off very, very small numbers of cells, and then they might go through a dormant period, and then all of a sudden they go like that. They just get big, and then they get to a point where they're using up all their resources, and they have to flatten out again because they don't have enough food to go around. Things like that. Sigmoid curve, you see it several places. All right. What we find is with the addition of this much base, at this point, this pH point right here is the equivalence point. That's where, in this case, the amount of base is exactly equal to the amount of acid. That's the equivalence point. So here's a better looking curve than the one I was drawing. That's one of your extra credits. And some curves are not very well behaved. On the surface, they look different. This is called a broken curve. And it's got different values on the axes here. So we've got, let's see, there's the title, Plotting Temperature versus Time for, let's see, what reaction is this? Temperature versus time. It must be up here. Temperature versus time. Okay, here it is. During a chemical reaction. So what we find is that there's what's known as a line of mixing in this particular case. So we got, as we, over time, the temperature is gradually increasing, and then all of a sudden it goes boom, right? That's the line of mixing. Big change in temperature. And it's sort of a disconnected curve. It's a broken curve. You get part of the curve down here and part of the curve up there. And you want to know that what's the difference in temperature between the two sections of the curve. Well, in order to get an accurate value, you need to be on the same X point. In order to do that, you need to draw a best fit curve here and a best fit curve here, because it may go down like this. And then this difference here is the change in temperature during mixing. Like I said before, this is extra credit. And it should be obvious why I made it extra credit, because it's pushing the boundaries. Okay, so this document I've prepared for online. I do this for online classes too. So it's a fillable form. So students can come in here and fill in their answers like that. You guys get the hard copy. But you can use this if you want. Fill it in this copy and then print it. So you've got those various, let's see, is there any no, this whole exercise. So you should be able to find the answers to some of these first questions in the discussion itself. And then you've got this experiment where temperature and volume, and describe what kind of curve it is. And when you put your answers in here, remember, 99.99% of all measurements have units with them. And even calculations will have units. And remember, whenever you do a calculation, if the units don't cancel, you have to keep every unit in your product, what you end up with. Right? So if I multiplied, let's see, if I had that pressure times volume equals K, and I had a value of, say, 3 atmospheres, and at a volume of 0.5 liters, then the value I would get from that is 1.5 liter atmospheres. See, they don't cancel, so I have to keep both of them. You do the same thing to the units that you do to the numbers. Multiply the units. And so if you get an answer in any of these places, report the units. Right? The unit could be complex. It could be this, and then divided by something else. I mean, it probably not going to be more than 3. Okay, there's pressure times volume, and draw the graph. Remember, what has to be included in the graph? Title, the axes, orientation, subdivisions, tick marks, and the numbers assigned to each of the tick marks. The variable for the axis and the units of measure. and then put your graph in, put your points in, draw your best fit curve. That's a complete graph. That's what I'm looking for. And the ones that have all that information in there, I grade fastest because I don't have to comment. I don't have to use a bunch of red ink. And then there's the bonus section. So this first one is the titration. Second one is, let's see, student collected the following. Time data. This is the mixing curve, right, for that one. And this one is, yeah, pH and volume of base. And then sometimes if you have lots of numbers in your database, you can do a what if without the graph, right? If the numbers are close enough together, then you can get really close. You can estimate the value without having to go to the graph. But the graph is one way to get a what if out of a data set. Okay, and there's your graph paper. Any questions?